Welcome to the Tabletop Gaming Guild. The Tabletop Gaming Guild is all about the experiences and memories that playing board games with friends and family can bring.
As always, your hosts James Wilson and
Nathan Wilson. Today we'll be talking about educational games, and I restricted my list to talk about educational games where while you're playing it you can pick things up, as opposed to real world games that have a lot of historical theme, but the purpose of them is not necessarily to teach things. And I also excluded games where you can teach with them, but they aren't inherently educational, because every game you can use to teach something. But if the game itself is teaching you, that's what I'm looking for in my list.
Well, my list is going to be any game that I think can teach a skill, can teach some form of history or education of any type, so super broad.
First game on my list is Compounded. Compounded is a science-themed game by designer Daryl Lauder. In Compounded, you are
taking different chemicals and try to create chemical compounds and keep them from exploding and pushing your luck.
And each chemical is accurate as far as what elements are in there. And there's corrosive compounds, there's flammable compounds. And the flammable compounds are really get interesting, because throughout the game there is risk of having lab fires. And if you have a lab fire, suddenly the compound you're working on is gone. You just lost a couple turns. So you really have to watch out. If it's flammable, you want to make sure you're trying to get that done quickly before it gets burned up.
Yeah, I really enjoyed Compound a lot. I played it with my daughter and you, and I think Dad while we were there. It was a fun cut-through thing where I could actually cause a compound fire on some of them. So where you were working on them, I could be like, no, your thing catches on fire. My game is going to be Robo Rally. This is on my list of questionably educational games, because I believe Robo Rally actually teaches the first building blocks of programming. It is a program movement game made by Richard Garfield where you're trying to race your robots across a course. The game is a lot of fun. You can bump the other robots and they get derailed and they have to follow their programming, so they can end up getting blown up or going down the wrong conveyor belt. So it can be a very frustrating game. It's pretty open on how you set up your courses. But I do recommend you try to keep your courses to a reasonable size, because the game could take forever otherwise. But Robo Rally does get that understanding of programmed movement, which is going to be a lot into robotics. So if they do like Lego Mindstorm or they do any of that stuff, it really gets them into that mindset of, I need to pre-plan my execution of this robot's movements before they actually do it, and they can't interact with it while it's doing it. So I think it's really good. It definitely teaches logic, and it definitely is good for that robotics or programming background if they want to go into that in the future.
Mechs vs. Minions, a great program movement game, but Robo Rally is a little bit stronger as far as teaching purposes.
Well, Robo Rally definitely is non-forgiving. That's why it gets frustrating for a lot of people when they get bumped or the robot gets slightly moved, because then it just executes this program that sort of wastes their time. But if you can get past that, it is a very fun game that does teach that.
Recently picked up a whole series of Genius Games games, and Genius Games specializes in science-themed games. Most are very good. Genius Game has a nice little habit where there's a lot of content within the game itself that you can learn from, but they always include an extra little booklet on the science behind their games. So they'll talk about the different chemical compounds and what they're used for. In Covalence, it's basically a cooperative hidden information game. You're trying to form compounds, but only one person knows what chemical compounds each person's trying to make. They'll have a series of cards, and some of them will have numbers on them, and some of them will have different elements on them, so you can give them clues, say, slide this card over to let them know this card that has hydrogen on it. So they're assuming, oh, you slid that hydrogen card over, I must have a hydrogen. And you're trying to do this with giving as few clues as possible, because you have a limited number of clues you can give and a limited number of guesses they can make.
So the gameplay itself, was that solid on this? Because I'm always worried about the pure educational ones having low replayability or lacking in fun factor.
The gameplay is alright. It is fairly unique. You got the elements that you're moving around on little cardboard chits and trying to form a compound, but in order to make it possible to even guess, they have to have a very restricted list of compounds that could be possible to make. And you have to learn what the possible compounds are and get an idea of what is in the game before you can really play it, and that takes a lot of the fun out of the game.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was afraid of on those. In a classroom setting, they can bust that out one of the days to try to reinforce the lessons that they were teaching previously, and it'd probably be a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You could even restrict it so these are the compounds we recently learned, and don't have them listed anywhere, and just people have to try to remember them, and if you remember them right, you've won.
Yeah, it works. So my next game is going to be Power Grid by Freeman and Freeze. This game is actually really good because it teaches market manipulation and being able to understand the fluctuating commodities and the cost management. So in Power Grid, you're trying to link up cities and power all the different cities with the power plants you purchase from the market, and then you have to purchase commodities. And the trick to the game is you're basically bidding for your power plants that you can get, you're bidding for your commodities you can get, and then when you power them, you get residual money back. And then you have to take this and balance it all out because it costs money to connect each of your cities that you need to make sure that you power enough of these that you can actually get returns on. So there's a lot of math involved in the game. You have to pay attention to, like, if everyone's buying coal plants and there's oil plants available, the coal plants are going to be super expensive because everyone's buying up all the finite amount of coal that you have per round. So there's a lot of thought that has to go into the game, and there's a lot of different areas that this covers educationally between mathematics and economics, and it's super fun. It's actually one of the top BGG games out there, which I highly recommend, and it's actually not expensive at all. So if you need to have multiple copies, you can get them pretty cheap, especially used. So that is Power Grid, which I do highly recommend that game, even if you don't want to get it for educational purposes. It's just a good game to play.
I also want to talk about Psychosis. This is another genius game. Psychosis, you are managing a cell.
I think Psychosis is the game of making me look stupid. I do like the worker placement aspect of the game, which is really, really cool. I'm really looking forward to playing with my daughter, which is learning that stuff right now. But go ahead, sorry.
Well, that's a nice thing about a lot of the genius games is you don't really have to understand the biology going in. They use the actual terminology, but in the description of what you're doing it, they describe it in board game terminology so that you can understand without having to, pick up the book constantly. So they're very good at actually doing that and making it approachable, yet having that science content. On the board, you'll have like the smooth ER, the rough ER, the nucleus, and you're making DNA, you're adding lipids to the DNA, you're creating enzymes, and then there's also expansion for the virus, which once you've played the game once, absolutely add in that expansion. It's not a true expansion because it comes with the game, but that adds a little bit of a take of that element in that you can actually introduce a virus into somebody else's cell and they have to fight off that virus, but it adds a lot of the player interaction to what is otherwise just a simple, straightforward worker placement game.
I think this one is, out of the Genius games, the one I'm most interested in. I really do like the worker placement thing, but I think it actually looks fairly solid, too. Oh, yeah, here. Who designed it? Try pronouncing that.
Let me pull that up, and I will tell you.
I got the first part, John.
Let's see. Designed by
John J.
I would say it's probably John Covey or Covey.
We are not good at pronouncing last names. This one's not good.
That's the main reason I don't necessarily list off a lot of designers, just because I can't pronounce most of the names of the ones I come up with.
I have no idea whether you're right or wrong, but I'm thinking that first one was pretty close. So yeah, we're gonna go with it. John J. Covey. Well, what was funny is I have the game right beside me. I was going to talk about it next, and then I see in the video that you have it right beside you, and I was like, oh man, he's going to do it, because I cannot pronounce that last name for the life of me. And now I'm going to cheat, because I'm going to do Time Stories, produced by Asmodee.
How is that educational?
Time Stories? That's easy, especially if you do like Americana or European history. They have tons of history ones, and basically what you're going to do is they're going to have a picture and a word.
Stop. You got the wrong game. Timeline, you mean, right?
Oh, no, yeah. I'm going to have to start that over. All right, my game is Timeline by Asmodee. So, like, I have Americana in front of me, and it's going to say, like, the fall of the House of Usher, or Facebook is founded. and you're going to have to put the card down to the left or right, and if you flip your card and you put it in the right position in the timeline, you get to leave the card. If not, you have another card, and the winner is the one that plays their last card. It's a fun game. It's definitely like a party-ish style game. You can get all sorts of different flavors of timeline. You can learn a lot of historic dates, but timeline is actually really good if you want to learn the dates of specific events and different parts of history. And that was timeline, not time stories.
The term game is loosely applied to this one, but it is actually fun for a party game.
Yeah, I don't know if it's actually a game at all. It's like an activity. I would definitely not play it with someone that is completely knowledgeable about the subject because they will win.
So I'm going to cheat on my next item. This game is representing war games. It's among the lighter end of war games, so Memoir 44 or Battle Cry, they're fairly similar games, but I chose Memoir as my game of choice for this. It's a Richard board game, and it's going through different World War II battles, and you're taking your troops and giving them commands. You're using a hand of cards to give them commands and move them. And the educational value in this is not only is it a real-world battle from World War II, at the beginning of the scenario while you're setting up, there's a section you're supposed to read that tells you who was involved and what was happening leading up to this battle, and also then at the end will tell you what the actual outcome of the battle was. There is a little bit more of a luck value in this one than there is in a lot of other war games, because you do roll dice. They are custom dice, so if you roll and you come up with an icon for a foot soldier, that means if you are fighting a foot soldier, you would do 1 damage to that foot soldier.
It's not going to be as educational as playing some of the GMT games that are like in-depth, down to minute details, and they do remove a little bit of the luck that Memoir 44 has. But it is an easier game to play by far. Memoir 44, simple rulebook, the commands and color style, card play is really good. So in general, Memoir 44 is one I would recommend over GMT games unless you're into like that chip-based battles. But yeah, Memoir 44 is definitely a good pick. What other games do you got, Nathan?
Are you done already?
No, I actually don't have that many educational board games.
But I can feed you some games that you have and you played if that
Like
helps
what?
you. Like Enigma.
Oh, no, it's not educational.
You know, it's a puzzle game. It's a lot of simple math puzzles.
I call that shenanigans. Told me Power Grid wasn't educational, and you're giving me Enigma?
It's as good as the other things on your list. It's a straight logic game.
What? When I played Enigma, all I was thinking about was burning it.
Let's see, what else? Lewis and Clark?
Well, that one's a loaded question. There's a horrible educational board game called Lewis and Clark, and then there's the real one that's Lewis and Clark that's rated really highly on BGG. Every time I buy Lewis and Clark, it's an educational board game, which is really horrible. And that's an example of how an educational board game can be bad. It was super horrible. It was answer a random fact to move. And you're sitting there with your little canoe on a river that's flowing, and you're not going anywhere. How's that even, like, physically possible? You should just be at least, like, floating down the river or something. I don't know. Maybe you can't paddle or something unless you answer an obscure educational question.
Yeah. There's a lot of those old board games like Global Pursuit or Trivial Pursuit. Just answer random trivia. One person in the group actually knows the answer to any of these questions, and the rest are just kind of at a loss. Okay, well, I have a few more to talk about. Tesla versus Edison. So this one's lightly educational. It is themed on the battle between AC current and DC current, and really it's a stock market manipulation game. Excellent game. It's trying to do scientific research to improve AC or DC. You're also buying into the different companies that are feeding the research. And like any stock market game, you don't technically own any of the things you're doing. How many shares you have at the end of the game is going to determine how many points you get and whether you won or lost. The big downside of this, it's one of those Kickstarter games that had some definite flaws. The rulebook is fairly poorly written. It took us a long time to figure out what was going on, and it was by the end of the first game had a sense of what we were supposed to be doing and what it intended versus what it actually seemed to have said. It was a lot of guesswork to figure out what we were supposed to be doing, and then finally figuring out, oh, this is the game.
How is this an educational?
It talks a little bit about AC and DC current themselves, as well as some of the technology behind them, as well as some of the differences. And it also incorporates a lot of the actual people that were involved in this, and some of the actual companies that were being formed dealing with AC and DC.
Sort of hoping you didn't have an answer there, because I was still angry about Power Grid.
along the same vein as New Science. Now, in New Science, you are publishing scientific articles, and it has a prerequisite system. So, in order to publish an article on quarks or antiquarks, it's not actually in the game, but I couldn't think of one. So, if you wanted to publish an article on quarks or antiquarks, you'd have to understand quantum physics first. You have to either at least have learned about this prerequisite science to be able to publish the next stage in the science, or you have to actually have published yourself. Like Tesla versus Edison, it does incorporate a lot of the actual people that were involved. You could be Isaac Newton, you could be Einstein, you could be Madame Curie.
That sounds interesting. One I just thought of that I really want to play is Wingspan, which is a new game by Elizabeth Hargrave. The Audubon Society even wrote up an article about it too. So if you're into bird watching or you're a bird enthusiast and you want to learn about the different bird species, each of the species of the birds for North America are printed on these cards. It teaches you about the foods that they would eat. You have to match up the habitats. It's an extremely good game. From what I understand, it's actually sold out everywhere. Either way, it looks like a cool game to play.
Yeah, that's absolutely one I want to play. Another one is Viral.
Oh, yeah.
So Viral is a cartoony style board game about the human body, and each player is a unique virus, and they're trying to infect the organs of the body. It's majority control, but also if you become too prevalent within any organ, the immune system will come and knock you out. So you have to diversify and spread out and get as much on the board without killing the host or activating the immune system by doing too well.
That's a game I've always wanted to play. Was Viral. It looks really cool.
Viral is by Gil de Ore and Antoine Sousa Laura.
Sure, that's completely wrong.
I know.
But, we tried. One of the games I wanted to talk about was Clans of Caledonia. It's borderline educational, but it does teach about the clans of Caledonia in the 19th century Scotland and how the Industrial Revolution affected Scotland at that time. So it's really interesting in there. It does give some educational background on the clans, and it gives you an idea of how the increased population caused agricultural to need to come back after everyone left it during the Industrial Revolution. So it was really cool. It's a great game. The only negative thing I can say about it all is the board's a little small, so it feels a little cramped when you're playing it. But it does teach resource management. It does teach a little bit of the history of Scotland, which very few games actually do.
Another genius game that I want to talk about is Subatomic. It's also by John Covey. It's like a 3-stage deck builders. You got these really basic cards that you're trying to buy first. 2 up quarks and a down quark to make a proton. Or 2 down quarks and an up quark to make a neutron. Or 2 photons to make an electron. And then once you got those, you can use those to buy double protons, double electrons. And once you got those, you can then start feeding that into trying to buy an element.
Sounds really cool.
Oh, Twilight Struggle is my last one to talk about. So, Twilight Struggle is Cold War era history, and very detailed as far as the educational value. Throughout the game, you're drawing cards, and all these cards are actual events that happened during the Cold War, and they'll have different effects that are as close as possible without being completely unbalanced to the actual effects of what happened. So, you might end up drawing a card that causes you to sign an accord, and may have to take troops out of Japan. And it's area control game with real world events. It can be very swingy, but it doesn't ever seem unfair.
Yeah, Twilight Struggle is definitely a game that's high up on my list that I want to play, and definitely see a lot of educational value to it. I think all board games in general are good educationally. Well, most board games are good educationally in the sense that they teach logic, planning, and strategy. And they can be super engaging too. So you can actually pick a board game that can fit with just about any group, and you can incorporate these into pretty much any lesson plan. They not only break up the monotony of teaching the classes or the students are receiving the information, it can break it up and make it fun.
Absolutely. The classroom setting is probably the least ideal setting to learn. You're not engaged, you're bored, you're easily distracted. Board games can really be helpful with that, and anything to entertain really helps you remember. If you enjoy learning, you're going to remember what you've learned.
Yeah, you can even modify games. You could take a game like Wits versus Wagers, where you have to guess a numeric value as close as possible, but you don't have to be the right one at it. You just have to know if you're right or someone else is right. And you can actually change that to have questions about the subject you're teaching.
No classroom is going to have equally good players. I mean, all the players are going to be different levels, and you don't want one person winning all the time in the classroom setting. So you can change the rules, increase the catch-up mechanic, give a little boost to the players that aren't as good, but you got to be real careful to that because you don't want people necessarily catching on to that.
Yeah, as long as you make it engaging and fun, and you can get some content in there that you want, and keep this classroom stimulated so they learn better. So that's our educational board games.
Thank you for listening to Tabletop Gaming Guild. We hope you listen to us again in 2 weeks. But until then, like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter or check us out on Instagram.
Or you can join our BGG Guild.